This week on Just Solutions. 4 years ago, Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico and severely damaged critical infrastructure, including the power grid. In the aftermath, mutual aid centres sprung up across the island as a bold grassroots relief effort emerged with the goal of restoring power to the people. But how is Puerto Rico doing now? And is that grassroots movement still going strong? And how are other communities struck by natural disasters responding with these type of grassroots initiatives? We speak with Juan Dávila and Tom Llewellyn, the filmmakers behind the award-winning documentary, The Response, How Puerto Ricans Are Restoring Power to the People. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Well, we are very pleased to be bringing The Response back to the Free Speech TV viewers for this 4th anniversary of Hurricane Maria, and I'm delighted to have Tom and Juan Carlos join us now. Good morning. Thank you both for being here. It's been 4 years since Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, 3 years since you documented the response in that documentary. How are things now? Juan Carlos, you are in Puerto Rico. How are things at the moment? Because we're still in hurricane season, of course.
Yeah, so right now, I think the biggest challenge that Puerto Rico is facing is the recent privatization of the energy system and the electrical grid. Recently, in Puerto Rico, the Luma Energy entered in a contract with the government of Puerto Rico to manage the transmission of the electrical grid, and the contract has been very unfair, particularly for workers and for the people of Puerto Rico, because it really this privatization and this new system really it makes it more expensive for the Puerto Rican government, right? And the other aspect of it is the workers, that the workers of the public electrical system are not, their rights are not recognized under this new company that is entering. And in that sense, the electrical grid now privatized has lost about 70% of their workforce, because they have not guaranteed the rights and the salary to the previous workers. So there has not been really an effective transition from the public to the private. And so right now what is happening is that this new company started operating with only 30% of what they need in Puerto Rico to handle the transmission of the electric and the distribution of the electrical grid. And now they are hiring people, but the people that they are hiring are inexperienced. And the Puerto Rico electrical grid is very complex because it is very precarious. There's also you need to understand the geography, the weather, and right now, if a hurricane comes, the company Luma is not really prepared to really handle a hurricane such as Hurricane Maria, if that were to happen. So if a hurricane comes, it's going to be worse than Maria for us. And besides that, there's also the whole electrical grid after Hurricane Maria that was never fixed. So there are things that were connected, but they were not properly rebuilt. So you're having a new company with workers that do not have experience. You're having a contract, the contract of the privatization that is costing a lot to the government of Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican people. And you have also an electrical grid that was never rebuilt how it was supposed to be rebuilt. So right now, if a hurricane comes, really we are going to be possibly worse than Maria, and we are experiencing constant blackouts on a weekly basis.
I think this is such an important point that you make because, of course, Hurricane Maria exacerbated an existing problem, which was not a reliable power source for Puerto Rico. And in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, as we have seen in the aftermath of other natural disasters, this disaster capitalism approach came in, and the then governor tried to sell off parts of the power grid. Of course, in 2019, there was a real political uprising against that because of what was happening. But it sounds like this is an ongoing issue in Puerto Rico. And this idea that we have these outdated power grids that are not fit for purpose, that are so beholden and reliant on fossil fuels, which then themselves are connected to the climate crisis. I know right now there are calls for President Biden to invest in renewable energy as part of a big infrastructure bill, including in Puerto Rico, and the Queremos Sol project to allow people to have solar panels and these localized power systems in Puerto Rico. How is that playing out when we're talking about these community response? How does a community response play out in the form of this energy as well? Energy democracy.
I think really the path to follow, it has to be the community response, right? But that cannot be separate from holding the government accountable, right? The government should also provide sufficient. It should provide a reliable energy system, because in the times that we're living, energy access to electricity is a human right, because lives actually depend on this. So really, what the path to follow is a community initiatives of alternative energy and more self-sustained systems. But these self-sustaining systems cannot be completely disconnected from the grid of the general power of the country, but it should be work more in a hybrid form, where people can be self-reliant, and at the same time the government should be responsible enough to provide the people the quality electrical grid that they need. So what needs to happen is a merge between the responsibility of the government, a very good state-run energy system, uh, uh, combined all together with good community development of energy projects. And right now, what is happening, and we got to be very careful, because many mayors are coming out and saying, well, we're going to make like a municipal electrical system that is going to benefit certain people from a certain towns or certain cities or a region in particular. But really, these municipal initiatives are failing, in the sense that they are not really providing. They are what they're doing is that they are designing systems so they can sell the electricity to the privatizer, right, to Luma. So in that sense, they are not really creating an independent and a self-reliant system. What they are doing is that they are making a project, a disguise on their community projects or municipal initiatives. But pretty much what when you look deeper into this, what they are doing is that they are presenting a form to generate energy so they can sell it to Luma, and which is the new company that manages, like I said before, the system. So they can sell it to Luma, and then Luma can again distribute it. So really, and becomes very dangerous, because in that way also what the government is doing is cleaning their hands on the responsibility that they have on providing a good and reliable electrical grid. And it's moving away from what I was saying before, that we should be pushing for hybrid alternatives that include state efforts coming from a good public-owned electrical grid, alongside community efforts that can sustain that and can support the electrical system in a case of disasters like Hurricane Maria.
Well, Tom, I'd like to bring you in here to carry on a point that Juan Carlos made there about the fact that we have these they're mutual aid centres that were established. We'll talk more about them. They're featured in the response, where communities came together in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria to really almost fend for themselves because of ineffective governance, which has a whole history in Puerto Rico we'll try to touch on.
Yep.
But the danger then of excusing the government then to abdicate its responsibility because of a community response. There's almost a fine line there, because I think that idea of community resilience when it comes to issues like the hurricane or even power distribution, that it could almost be co-opted, that message, for the government to say, we're just going to abdicate from this. We leave it up to the private sector to take responsibility. There's a connection there. Can you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'd just like to start by just pointing out, I mean, this is a global problem that we're facing. You know, according to a recent report from the UN, in the past 20 years, there have been over 7,000 major disaster events causing 1.2 million deaths, affecting more than 4 billion people. I mean, that's half the population of the globe, and resulting in almost $3 trillion worth of global economic losses. So, you know, community responses cannot come up against this great wall of a problem that we're facing on their own. We absolutely need to have strong government responses and to really try and get in front of this by enacting really powerful climate change focused legislation, which the infrastructure bill is starting to approach, but is not strong enough at all. And so that's kind of the crux of what we're facing. You know, it is such a big issue. But when it comes to kind of mutual aid centers on the ground, you know, what's really kind of gives me hope is that it's what happened in Puerto Rico, you know, with the mutual aid centers that popped up. You know, they were not happening in a bubble. So there have been so many other examples around the world where similar things have happened. I mean, even at that exact same moment, we had historic fires in Northern California that were impacting, everybody in Northern California, but especially impacting the undocumented communities that were not able to, get the same amount of government support. And so there was a number of organizations that came together and they created UndocuFund and raised millions of dollars in a very short period of time. And not only were they giving that kind of government support to the undocumented community in Northern California, but similarly to Puerto Rico, they were realizing that they needed to address the kind of collective trauma that had occurred. And so in the film, in Puerto Rico, we document how mutual aid centers, not only started by providing food and those kind of basic necessities, but moved over to also providing things like acupuncture, to reduce not only the physical pain, but also the emotional pain. And in Northern California, UndocuFund was doing the exact same thing. So we're seeing that, there is a kind of human response that occurs during these disasters. For the last 45 years, we've been documenting disasters all over the world on the Response podcast and in our film. And that's what really comes out more than anything else, is that disasters really do bring the best out of people in most cases, most of the time. And so one of the goals of our show and our work really is to kind of break down that kind of secondary fear about how people react, because for the most part, individuals react very well, but governments and institutions not always quite so much.
Well, what about those mutual aid centers that emerged in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria? Have they continued to operate and transform as the needs have transformed? Because, of course, since then, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, which stops us gathering together in community. Certainly it did originally. But Juan Carlos, talk about that, how those mutual aid centers that sprung out of Hurricane Maria and the community response, how they have now evolved, and what the work is that they're doing now.
Yeah, so the mutual aid centers in Puerto Rico have evolved in many forms. There are some instances where some mutual aid centers have continued and right now are taking on other projects. However, they are still focused on the hunger, on the immediate necessities, and on the rapid response. But pretty much, I think what is important, is also understanding the networks that were behind the mutual aids, and these networks of mutual aids that were built, that these networks continue and remain. In the case, like I was saying before, of the other ones that have in some way or the other transformed, we've seen, for example, the place where I work right now with Agitarte. They have the Casa Taller, and during the very beginning of the mutual aid, I'm sorry, during the very beginning of the pandemic, they were making mutual aid initiatives, and this would be providing people with hand sanitizers, distributing masks. Also, I was working in part of that, in that project. We were also making videos of what people could do in their homes as everybody was on lockdown. There were cultural content being produced so that people can consume cultural products from their homes remote. So it was, and in this way, help and ease the loneliness that perhaps for some people it generated the beginning of the pandemic. So you would see how, for example, Agitarte and Papel Machete with their Casa Taller were pretty much able to shift with the resources that they had and the networks that they have towards the service of attending the necessities in the pandemic. And like that, we can also see another example, and this one is featured in the film The Response, the one in Caguas with the social diners and the activists and organizer Giovanni Roberto, that when the pandemic started, the government was asking people to remain on their homes, but was not providing, and still have not provided, and enough support for people to stay at their homes. So what they were doing is that they were going around the communities that they worked, distributing food, and at some point also, they made a caravan through the city to demand the government support for the people who they were asking to stay at their homes. So in that sense, it's also it also shows the importance of connecting this with of connecting efforts of mutual aid also with street action, and that both things go hand in hand and can benefit and work together towards our liberation and our projects of self-management.
We'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching right now. Are efforts like this emerging in your community? We're all living through the impact of the climate crisis right now, and we are seeing these community responses emerge. Tom, I'd like to bring you back in to talk about that mental health component. We talked about the community trauma that, of course, happened in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, that we are seeing happening in communities around the world. And of course, this idea of social connection, that is really inherent in how communities can survive either natural disasters or war. And in fact, it's been very much acknowledged that can be a predeterminant to survival on a very, very basic level, these social connections. Can you talk a little bit about that, and particularly how COVID has compromised people's ability to connect socially, but at the same time, these grassroots community responses are really working in so many different ways to maintain those social connections?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you mentioned, it's been well documented that our social relationships actually can be one of the greatest determinants to whether or not we survive during a disastrous moment. I mean, this was studied in Japan during the 2011 triple disaster, where they found that people that had more relationships and that their depth of relationship would be the deciding factor of whether or not somebody lived or died, made it out before the tsunami came, all things being equal. A similar study happened in Chicago in the early 90s when there was the great heat wave. So we know that these social relationships are really, really important. I mean, they're more important in many ways than having a go bag, than having a stash of weapons and, all of the stuff that's happening around with preppers. It's really, how much are you connecting with other people in your communities? What are those opportunities? And so that's one of the things that I often push when I have conversations with people about this, is just like, double down on your relationships, try and get back to that. I mean, right now we're facing this incredible global loneliness epidemic, where people have, oftentimes not even a single close friend that they can rely upon. This has been a shift over the last 30 years, but it's significant, and we really need to address it. In my personal life, I'm fortunate to grow up in a small community in the Oakland Hills, where I've recently returned to, and in this place, we're an unincorporated part of the community of the county, and so we maintain all of our own physical infrastructure. We maintain our roads and our water systems and all that collectively. Even though I refer to us as more of a semi-autonomous, unintentional community. But one of the things that we've really kind of started to work on in the last few years is our fire prevention, because we're in this incredibly high fire danger area. And so we've started to have community work days where, for once a month, for 3 months, or actually the first 6 months of the year, every year, we go around and we cut all the brush and we remove that together. And there was some curmudgeons in the community that were saying, all that work you're doing, you're just going to buy yourself a minute or two. With the fire comes, all of our houses are going to burn to the ground. And to that I responded, one, like, yes, we're going to buy ourselves a minute or two, and that could be the determinants of life or death. But also, we are strengthening our relationships with each other by rubbing shoulders. We're reducing our fear about fire, because we're kind of taking charge. We have agency in the situation by directly addressing the problem. And if there were to be a fire that were to come through and burn down all of our houses, we would have a greater social cohesion that would be not only there to support each other and through that trauma of losing our homes, but also we'd be able to build greater political power because of the connections that we had when it came to negotiating with the state and our local county officials to be able to rebuild in this place. So there's that type of interaction, that rubbing shoulders, it's that kind of doing collective work together and addressing the problem, even if it's in small ways, can go a really long way towards reducing that fear and that anguish and that trauma, which is associated, with climate change and climate fueled disasters.
It does seem we're at a bit of a tipping point right now where we're seeing tension between, and maybe it's just in the US, this idea of individualism and rights, when it comes to mask mandates or even vaccinations, and this idea that my choices will certainly impact the health of other people. And the fact that there are so many studies done to show that social connections and working in tandem with your community is actually really the only way forward.
Yeah, and and just to address kind of what you're talking about with COVID earlier, that it's actually been something that has been kind of like a bright light of COVID. That silver lining is that people really have stepped up to support their neighbors. The concept of mutual aid has gone mainstream. The fact that it's being talked about in CNN and Teen Vogue and being published all over the place, it feels like everyone and their mother, for lack of a better term, are engaging in mutual aid projects. So many people I know were distributing masks, were just making sure that people were getting their medications, going in and running errands for other people, doing big collective shopping runs to support their neighbors. But then also not only just supporting the people that they, in their direct social networks, but going out and supporting, the unhoused and making sure that people were able to shelter in place. And Juan was referring to that in Puerto Rico, where there wasn't enough government support to be able to allow people to stay home. These mutual aid centers were able to kind of repurpose their work. And instead of just providing food in a centralized location, they were able to go and make sure that people in their communities were cared for. And we're seeing that, in Puerto Rico, but there's also resilience hubs all over the world, which are doing very similar work. And that's some place that I feel like there needs to be more of a partnership and more support coming from our government to be able to provide enough funding to localized resilience hubs that then can support their communities when these disasters occur. And also are able to have a better idea of what support is needed when they happen. And so that when a disaster does happen, when an agency like FEMA comes in, they can go in and they have a point. They are able to say, okay, now what kind of support can we offer to you? What kind of support can we offer to your community? And that's really what's I think going to change disaster response as a whole, is a greater partnership. And again, as we were saying earlier, it's not enough for communities to be self-sufficient, to be in a position of precarious resilience. Really what we need is stronger partnerships and that funding to come from the top down into these grassroots initiatives, which are better able to serve their own communities.
Well, that's a point Juan Carlos also made very well earlier, certainly in relation to Puerto Rico. And in the last couple of minutes that we have, I would like to bring it back to Puerto Rico and touch on a topic briefly that is explored in the film, The Response, that Puerto Rico is unique insofar that it is at the intersection of so many issues, and one of them being the lack of self-governance because of the ongoing colonial policies that are inflicted on Puerto Rico. And that lends itself then to that type of disaster capitalism and the lack of proper infrastructure there. Juan Carlos, in the last couple of minutes that we have, is anything happening around self-governance in Puerto Rico, maybe emerging from this community response from Hurricane Maria?
I think there's still so much to work with. In the sense of us, having more autonomy and more self-governance. Really, I think one of the things that really is a problem right now is the Fiscal Control Board. The Fiscal Control Board in Puerto Rico is a body instituted by the United States Congress in 2016 to handle the economic crisis of Puerto Rico, particularly the made-up debt that Puerto Ricans have. Mm-hmm. And in this sense, the U.S. Congress appointed a 7-member board that has more authority than the government of Puerto Rico, which, when I say the government of Puerto Rico, I'm talking about elected officials. We have a 7-person appointed board by the U.S. Congress that has more authority than the elected officials that we have here, and this creates a huge issue for us right now. And although it does embody what already was happening, right? It shows that it evidences that here in Puerto Rico, we don't have autonomy. We don't have really decision-making power of what is happening in this country. I think, the first step for us to move forward and to achieve our liberation and decolonize this country, the first thing that we need to do, the next step, is really making sure that the U.S. Congress repeals the Promesa law, which is the law that enacts and gives power to this Fiscal Control Board. This is really a real issue right now. The Fiscal Control Board is a real issue in Puerto Rico because, for example, they manage a public policy, but it doesn't cost them votes, for example. It doesn't cost them popularity as an elected politician would be. So in this sense, this board has more freedom to push the neoliberal agenda that is coming all the way from Wall Street, supported by Washington. Mm.
Well, we are delighted to have Juan Carlos join us along with Tom Llewellyn, and really pleased to be able to bring The Response back to the Free Speech TV audience to mark the 4th anniversary of Hurricane Maria. But it's also premiering on YouTube on Monday as well. And I would encourage people as well to check out the podcast series of The Response. As we mentioned earlier, Tom, you're looking at community response in so many different places, from Texas to Puerto Rico and many places in between. And of course, Just Solutions is now available as a podcast. We would love you to subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, join us same time, same place next week from Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.